You're listening to Missing Persons, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, DNA ID, Beyond Bizarre True Crime, Zodiac Speaking, Scene of the Crime, and 3 Men and a Mystery. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
The views and opinions expressed by guests on this podcast do not necessarily represent those of the podcast, its creators, or sponsors. If you would like to discuss a missing persons case on this podcast, please be sure to visit missingpersonspodcast.net. This episode may contain unsettling or disturbing subject matter. Listener discretion is advised.
Episode 51, Jodi Huisentruit. Much of the information from this write-up is taken from findjodi.com. If you're interested in even more details about this case, please head over to that website. One of its curators, Caroline Lowe, is our guest today. In 1995, Jodi Huisentruit was a 27-year-old morning news anchor for KIM-TV in Mason City, Iowa. Jodi's case is one of the more well-known cases we've covered, but here's a little background about Jodi for those of you who aren't familiar with her case. Jodi Sue Huisentruit was born to parents Maurice and Imogene on June 5, 1968. She graduated from St. Cloud State in 1990 and moved to Cedar Rapids, Iowa to be a CBS News station bureau chief there. She then moved to a job back in Minnesota before returning to Iowa for the KIMT position. Jodi has been described universally as bubbly, fun, outgoing, and friendly. She was the ultimate people person who chatted with fans while she did errands and preferred to be out and about rather than at home. We will get some more insight as to what Jodi was like as a person from her niece Kristen, who is one of our guests today. Oh, and another thing, Jodi was a fantastic golfer. Her high school team won the state championship 2 years in a row, quite an accomplishment. On June 26, 1995, Jodi attended a golf tournament at the Mason City Chamber of Commerce in the afternoon with some work colleagues. She stayed for dinner and left the Mason City Country Club shortly before 8 p.m. She called a friend in Mississippi at 8:24 p.m. from the phone in her apartment, but her friend wasn't home. Jodi spoke briefly with the friend's husband, who later said that she was her usual bubbly self. The next 8 hours or so of the timeline are fuzzy. We just don't know whether Jodi stayed in or went out, had people over or not. We do know that she was asleep in her apartment at 4 o'clock the next morning. It was Tuesday, June 27, 1995. Jodi was scheduled to be at the news station daily by 3:30 a.m. to prepare for her 6 a.m. anchor shift. But that morning, there was no sign of her. News producer Amy Coons called Jodi's apartment at 4:10 a.m. She later said that there had been times in the past where Jodi had overslept, and she admitted to being a little annoyed when Jodi answered the phone and had clearly been asleep. She assured Amy she'd be there in 20 minutes, and according to Amy, she sounded like her typical self. 20 minutes was realistic because Jodi lived within a mile from the TV station. Jodi almost certainly jumped in the shower, dressed, and then zipped out of her apartment in sneakers with wet hair. I'll get into how we know that in a minute. So she left her apartment and headed to her car, a red Miata she had just bought herself that she was very proud of. It was still dark outside, being only about 4:35 or 4:40 a.m., but the Miata was only 12 steps from the entrance to Jodi's building. Nonetheless, it was somewhere in those 12 steps where police believe Jodi was abducted. Jodi never showed up at the station that morning. Amy Coons had to scramble to don hair and makeup and take the anchor seat in Jodi's place. Although she had been late before, Jodi had never just failed to show up altogether, so her co-workers were alarmed. Around 7 a.m., just after the newscast ended, Amy asked a co-worker to call police to check on Jodi. At 7:13 a.m., the KIM TV co-worker called police to perform a welfare check. Remarkably quick to respond, at 7:16 a.m., the first Mason City police officer arrived at the Key Apartments, Jodi's apartment complex. No one answered the door at her second-floor apartment, but then the officer walked outside and noted her red Miata. The car was parked in the lot and appeared undisturbed, but the stuff strewn around the car told a different story. The key to the Miata lay on the ground, bent as though someone had torqued on it. A pair of red high heels was also lying on the blacktop, as were a blow dryer, a pair of earrings, and some hairspray. It was clear to anyone observing the scene that Jodi had been waylaid while carrying all this stuff, possibly as she inserted her key into the door lock of her car. A partial palm print found on her Miata was lifted by police, but we don't know whether it has any connection to her abduction, and it does not seem that police have been able to link it to anyone. Police entered Jodi's apartment to look for signs that anything was amiss. If they found anything, it hasn't been disclosed to the public, although Lieutenant Frank Stearns of the Mason City PD later said the toilet seat was found in the up position. If true, and it was not a first responder who perhaps accidentally left the seat up, it raises the question of whether Jodi had a male visitor to the apartment. No one has come forward admitting to being there, and even if she did have a visitor, why would he attack her outside in the parking lot instead of inside the unit? Police became convinced that Jodi had been waylaid in the parking lot and abducted from the scene in a vehicle. Police canvassed Jodi's building, but no one saw Jodi that morning. But 3 residents of the complex told police that they heard screams in the early hours of Tuesday morning. Those screams could have been Jodi as she struggled with whoever accosted her from behind as she unlocked her car. Yet, despite hearing a woman screaming, no one thought to call the police. One neighbor also reported seeing a white van in the parking lot that morning, and some reports say its engine was running and its lights were on. Again, whether this is connected to Jodi's disappearance or not is unclear. There have been a few persons of interest in Jodi's case over the years. The first and most well-known of these is Jodi's friend, John Van Cise. Van Cise was a single man 22 years Jodi's senior, whom Jodi was just friends with, but who, it's speculated, was interested in more than Jodi was willing to offer in terms of a relationship. This is because he named his boat after her and in June had thrown her a surprise 27th birthday party at Sully's Bar in Clear Lake, Iowa. Further, Jodi spent the weekend before she disappeared, June 23rd to 25th, in Iowa City with Van Cise, her good friends Annie Cruz and former colleague Tammy Baker, and Van Cise's son Trent, who was a college student in Iowa City at the time. The group stayed at Trent's apartment. Jodi and Tammy shared a bedroom. The group spent the weekend in Clear Lake boating and dancing. Jodi later wrote about the weekend in the last entry in her diary, saying how much fun she'd had water skiing on Van Cise's boat that weekend. On the morning that Jodi vanished, Van Cise thrust himself into the investigation by showing up with 2 other men at the Key Apartments quite early while police were still investigating the scene. Van Cise immediately attracted police attention by asking about what was going on and then telling police that he was the last person to see Jodi alive. Of course, this was an odd statement considering the fact that no one had said anything about Jodi being deceased. And he told police something that no one has ever been able to verify. He said that on the night before Jodi vanished, sometime after her phone call to her friend in Mississippi, Jodi had come over to his apartment to watch a video of the surprise party he had thrown her. All of these factors caused police to look hard at Van Cise. He has repeatedly denied any involvement in Jodi's abduction and has told the media that he passed a polygraph exam with flying colors. A friend of Van Cise's, LaDonna Woodford, later said that she testified before a grand jury that Van Cise was home when she called him about 6 a.m. on June 27, 1995, and they went for a walk in the neighborhood early that morning. If it's true that Van Cise was at home at 6 a.m. on the day Jodi vanished, it makes a timeline whereby he abducted her at 4:40 a.m. pretty tight, although not impossible. There were a couple of other persons of interest whose names have come up in Jodi's case. One was the convicted Minnesota serial rapist Tony Jackson, who was living just 2 blocks from the news station in Mason City, Iowa, at the time she disappeared. There was a rumor that he and Jodi frequented the same bar. Jackson has denied any involvement, and there's really nothing connecting him to the crime. Another convicted sex offender, Thomas Korskadin, was also in the general area. He was interviewed by Mason City investigators 3 months after Jodi vanished, and again a few years later. But in 2004, he took a voluntary polygraph test, and investigators said that they were moving on to other avenues of investigation. Korskadin passed away in January of this year. There are some weird things that happened in this case. In 2008, a reporter at the Mason City Globe-Gazette received a copy of Jodi's personal journal, the original of which was in the possession of the police. The sender remained anonymous, but an investigation revealed that she was Cheryl Ellingson, wife of the former Mason City police chief. Cheryl was a former employee of the Globe-Gazette, but it's unclear why she sent the diary to the newspaper. The Globe-Gazette reviewed the diary and ran some articles excerpting Jodi's writings about how she was interested in changing jobs and the fun she had had at the lake with Van Cise and her friends. There were a few incidents that made people wonder whether Jodi was the target of a stalker, perhaps an obsessed fan who saw her on TV. In October 1994, Jodi filed a report with the Mason City Police Department saying that she had been out for a run and had been followed by a small, white, newer model pickup truck. The truck made her uncomfortable enough that she wanted to alert the police. The truck and the driver have never been identified. Jodi took a self-defense class a few months before her abduction, and she told the instructor that she felt she had been followed. And at the golf tournament on the day before she went missing, Jodi told her colleagues that she was going to change her phone number because she was getting strange calls. Clearly, Jodi was unsettled by something, but we just don't know whether these were all inconsequential events or something more. Although we have very limited information about this, 2 federal grand juries have reportedly been convened in connection with Jodi's case. No indictments have been handed down, but in March of 2017, John Van Cise was subpoenaed by a federal grand jury in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He drove from his home in Phoenix, Arizona, to provide a DNA sample, fingerprints, and palm prints. No charges have been forthcoming. That same month, Mason City Police obtained a search warrant to place GPS tracking devices on 2 vehicles connected to Van Cise. He had not owned these vehicles at the time of Jodi's disappearance. Police Chief Jeff Brinkley has stated that the GPS searches did not produce any evidence. The search warrant affidavits for the searches have remained sealed, so we don't know what probable cause investigators provided the judge to convince him to approve these searches. But it is believed that it was hoped that Van Cise had visited the location where Jodi's remains were placed and the GPS on his vehicle would reflect that information. But it was not to be. Jodi was declared legally dead in 2001. On June 27, 2022, Jodi will have been missing for 27 years. That is the same number of years that she was alive. Mike Morford sat down to talk with Jodi's niece, Kristen Nathy, as well as Caroline Lowe, an investigative journalist who has been following Jodi's case nearly from the beginning. Those conversations are coming up after a word from our sponsors.
Hi, Kristen, and thank you for coming on Missing Persons to discuss your Aunt Jodi's case with us.
Hi, Mike. Thank you so much for having me.
It's our pleasure, and this is a big case. It's been talked about for a long time. There's a big anniversary coming up on the date of it, and each year that passes, I know a lot of us want to see the case solved, and obviously, I'm sure that's the case for your family. So in advance of that anniversary, we want to get the word out there and bring a little bit more attention on the case if we could help do that.
Well, we definitely appreciate that. And, thank you for taking the time to feature Jodi's case.
So Jodi was your aunt, and I'm just curious, how old were you when she went missing, and how close were you with Jodi?
So I was 11. I was probably about 3 months shy of turning 12 when Jodi disappeared. I was very close with Jodi. I think she was like 15 when I was born. So, in a way, she was kind of almost like an older sister, but also an aunt. She was very involved in my life growing up. I mean, every holiday she was there. Even not on holidays, I'd always get cards from her. She'd always be calling. She'd always want to be involved with my life and, know what's going on. How is school going? How are your friends? She's just very involved.
Was it cool having sort of her as being a news personality? Was she a sort of a celebrity in your mind? Was it cool having someone in your family that was sort of in the spotlight?
Yeah, it was definitely unique. There was a time period that she was a news anchor it was a station in Alexandria, which aired in my hometown. I would go to school and I would have classmates say, "Oh, I saw your aunt on TV this morning reporting the news." Or, I think I remember one day, it was my birthday and she was into the newscast and she made sure to add in a little note about my birthday. And of course, everybody who watched that channel in the morning saw it and knew it was my birthday. She would come and sometimes do stories in my hometown, or, I remember she came, we had the county fair and, she would have to come and represent the station. And, I'd kind of come and help her out and hang out with her. And of course, all my friends wanted to be around and, talk to Jodi and, because in a way she was kind of like a little local celebrity being on the news and being on television. But she was also just very, personable and, very bubbly, and she just loved people and loved being around them, loved getting to know people. So, people just kind of naturally gravitated towards her.
Now, with that kind of job, being in the spotlight, I guess it's a double-edged sword because you've got the good side of it where people like seeing you, they like hearing from you. But then you have, you're out there, your business is out there, people you have that are following you may not always have the best intentions. Did Jodi ever discuss any negatives about having that kind of career?
I wasn't aware of it at the time. Of course, I was young, but I know my mom and I have had those conversations, and, she has said that, there were concerns, people maybe giving too much attention. I think at one point when she was in Mason City, she had some concerns about possibly being followed. But Jodi was the kind of person who really wanted to think the best of people. Maybe it was almost to her downfall at some way that, she really wanted people to be happy. And when they were talking with her, she always gave people her full attention. And, I think that's why some people maybe thought they knew her better than they actually did. She's in their TVs, on the news every morning. And then when they'd see her out in the community, she would be so personal with people and would take the time to talk to them. So everybody felt maybe like she was her friend when, that's not always the case.
Yeah. And, obviously there's been a lot of different TV shows made about her case. There's been podcasts, there's been articles on the internet. So I think a lot of people maybe feel like they know Jodi from just learning about her and seeing her talk and all that stuff. But obviously they didn't really know her. What was she like, not as a newscaster, but just as your Aunt Jodi? I mean, what was she into, and what was a typical day out of work for her?
So, from my perspective, spending time with her, she, when she would come to visit, it wasn't like she would come and just, do the niceties of, saying hi and, seeing how I was doing or anything like that. Like, she really wanted to spend quality time. when she would come to visit, my friends would come over. She treated my friends like they were also her nieces. She'd take us out to the park. She would, I remember one time she took myself and another friend when she was working in Minnesota. She took us actually to the newsroom and let us sit behind the desk. And then she took us horseback riding and just made a whole day of it. She was really involved and genuinely involved. She wanted to spend that quality time and really, I've never met someone who had such a lust for life and a lust for people and just really had so much joy in life. Just really loved every day getting up and, doing something different.
Yeah. And I know a lot of times when there's a family tragedy or something bad happens within a family, kids are sort of sheltered from it, protected from it. When Jodi first went missing, did you really get a grasp of what was going on, or did your family try and keep you in the dark as not to upset you as a young person?
Yeah, I remember the day. I think I was actually one of the first people who got the call. I was at home with my dad, my mom, and my grandma, and I think my grandma's sister. They had gone on a trip up in northern Minnesota. And so I remember that morning the call came through, and it was the Mason City Police. And of course, they recognized on the phone that I was too young to take a call like that. So they asked for my mom or my dad, and my dad took the call. And I was just, when you hear the police, I knew my aunt was in Mason City. So I knew that it was the local police where she was at. So my first thought as a kid was oh, she's been in a car accident or something has happened. And I was watching my dad's face on the phone and just kind of hearing his tone change. And I just, was trying to put two and two together, what is actually going on? And I remember he got off the phone and I asked him, well, what's going on? What happened to Jodi? And my dad said that she was missing. And in my mind, I'm I knew about kids going missing. There was a big case in Minnesota for Jacob Wetterling. And so, I knew kids go missing, they get kidnapped, but I had never, I guess, comprehended that adults could go missing as well. And so, I remember that summer I was just kind of being, my parents were doing their best to kind of take care of me and also take care of the case. And I just remember spending a lot of time, thankfully we had a really supportive community at that time, and people were taking care of me when, either my dad had to go to work or my mom had to travel for the case. But I do remember that, my parents wouldn't let me watch the news a lot. They wouldn't really talk about the case in front of me. I knew a little bit of what was going on, but I didn't get the full specifics. And, probably not until I was in maybe junior high or high school did, my parents really tell me about kind of some of the other things with the case.
And when the case happened, when it first broke that she had been abducted, was there any in the family? Was there any kind of feeling of someone we know might have done this, something where maybe Jodi had told someone in your family about someone she was worried about? Anyone that your family their minds went to say, go check this person out?
I don't remember that at the time. It might have been the case again, because I was a kid, I probably wasn't privy to some of those discussions. As years have gone on and as I've learned more about the case and, talking with my mom and different family members, I think there was. I think, they leaned towards the possibility of it being a certain person. But, it's not something that we discuss or really put out in the public. We have our thoughts on it, but, until there's clear, concrete evidence, we just don't really want to go there.
Sure, and I understand that, and I definitely don't want to ask you to name someone in particular, but I am curious though if this person that you maybe had some interest in, did you have did your maybe your aunt, your mom, your dad, excuse me, have any recollection way back then when the case first happened that this person might be involved, or was this something that they sort of started thinking after the fact?
I think it was after the fact. I don't think it was too far after the fact, but I think it was, I think at the time when, someone goes missing, you don't think at first that it's going to be somebody who, is somebody that you think first you're just trying to wrap your head around exactly what happened, and having a family member go missing is just, you're trying to wrap your head around that. And then you start going down the avenue of, well, who could have potentially done it? And, I think we had an inkling, let's just put it that way. And I think, it probably wasn't too far after it happened that, we started to go down a certain path of who it could be.
Was it frustrating? And again, I know you were a kid during a portion of this time, but maybe in talking with everyone that was older in your family, was it frustrating to not get an arrest or find her, or, as weeks turned into months and then months to years? Was that difficult on your family?
Absolutely. I think as thinking back on that time, of course, I was a kid, so I might have been a little bit naive, but I thought, she's going to be found. Like, it's probably a misunderstanding or something happened, and, maybe she went somewhere, and, cell phones weren't a thing back in the time, so it's like, well, maybe, she's just trying to find a phone. But, as days turn into weeks, turn into months, turn into years, it's a very hard situation, and it is very frustrating. It's very frustrating that, there's just not enough there to really bring a case against anyone at this point. And to not have closure, to not have her be found, there's no manual for how to deal with ambiguous loss like this. And I know that we're not the only family that has a missing family member, but it's just, it's hard. It's very hard.
Yeah. And eventually you came to a very difficult decision. Your family had Jodi declared dead. How hard was that as a family to sort of give up hope that she was out there alive someplace and have to come to that conclusion that she was dead and have her declared legally dead?
Very hard. I remember I was a teenager when the family, we made that decision, and I struggled with it, to be completely honest. I felt like, it just felt like we were saying that this was done, that, the case was closed and this was done. And after having long conversations with my parents about it, I found out it's more, about closing up some of the paperwork and, some of the outstanding accounts for Jodi, more so than, saying that the case is closed. The case isn't closed. We're not giving up. We're not, and we're not saying that, obviously as much time has passed, the hope of finding Jodi alive gets slimmer and slimmer. But, who knows? There's stranger things have happened. But yeah, that was very hard.
Yeah. And, we're coming up on the 27th anniversary of the date Jodi went missing. And I think as this time passes every year that comes around, it's a good opportunity to get the word out there and have new attention on the case. But on your family, does it take a toll on you, sort of having to rehash everything and having everything come to the surface again each time an anniversary rolls around and you have to, and there's new attention on the case?
Yeah, it does. Every year it's really hard to put into words, honestly. It's sad. You get angry. You get frustrated. With each year that passes, it's just, you feel like you want there to be some sort of progress. You want there to be at least feel like we're moving in some sort of direction where eventually the case is going to be solved. And it just, for me personally, it feels like every year, while there's some progress and, there's different tips and different, possibilities, it feels like we haven't moved any closer than we were when it happened in 1995. And, for me, that's just incredibly sad. And, it does frustrate me. It just feels like we should be further along than we are right now.
Yeah. And how important, how helpful would it be to at least find Jodi's remains? I mean, after all this time, that may be difficult, but would it bring any kind of relief to at least find her remains? So you could maybe say a proper goodbye or give her a proper memorial?
Absolutely. I think it would definitely help to know where she is, to be able to bring her back home, to have a place where we can go. There's not a day that goes by that we don't think of Jodi and, we don't talk to her and pray for her. And, it's definitely not a case where, we need that necessarily, but it would be nice to sort of bring that closure, and just to be able to have her be with her family, potentially be with her mom, and to have that place where we can go visit. And, ideally from that point to have that, then to also be able to dig back and find out what happened and, maybe trace that back to actually bringing justice.
And that's a good point, because if somehow Jodi's remains were found, that might also lead to more clues, which might ultimately lead to the person that did this.
Exactly.
How hopeful are you that someone will be ID'd? And even if, let's say they're not even alive anymore, would it still be helpful to know who it was and maybe put a name and a face to who did this?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it would be incredibly helpful. I think about my grandma who passed away without knowing where Jodi is, what happened to her, and who did it. I think about my mom who's had to deal with this, this nightmare of a situation. And it would just be so nice for both of them, and I'll throw myself in there too, just to be able to know the details and, be able to, it's not necessarily that it's going to be closed. You're always going to live with this. It's going to be a part of your life, whether you know what happened and know where the person is. But it would be nice to at least close that portion of the story.
Yeah, that makes sense. And if there's anything, that still might provide some hope, it's that we're seeing cases that are solved that are 20, 30, 40 years old. So you always have to keep some kind of hope that, maybe something's found, something's uncovered, somebody comes forward that maybe wouldn't say something 10, 20 years ago, but now is willing to talk. So you can't give up hope, and hopefully your family will stay strong and keep searching for the truth, and we'll do our part to help keep spreading the word so people know it's still unsolved.
Absolutely. We still hold out hope. Like you said, we've seen cases 20, 30, 40 years later that are being solved. And, we're incredibly blessed because, we have the Find Jodi team who volunteer their time to help us with this case. And, they're a fantastic group of people, and we're just incredibly blessed to have, their support and their assistance. It's just been wonderful for us. So, we're very lucky that way.
Well, again, I wish you all luck on your search for answers and for justice. And I hope somehow, some way that despite the passage of time, you get that information and find out who did this.
Thank you so much, Mike.
Hi, Caroline, and thank you for coming on Missing Persons to discuss Jodi's case with us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me and for keeping the spotlight on Jodi Huisentruit's case.
Yeah, it's a fascinating case and one that people that listen to our podcast are probably quite familiar with. And you've got an interesting work history. I know you've worked in a couple different fields and sort of combined them. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and where you've come from and exactly what it is you do now?
Sure. Most of my background was an investigative reporter at WCCO TV in Minneapolis, the CBS station there. I spent 34 years there, started as a newsroom clerk in 1977. I like to tell people it was right out of kindergarten, but that's not true. And I worked my way up into a reporting position, became a crime reporter, and then eventually did more investigative/crime work. And about 11 years ago, I had an opportunity to move to California and try something different in management, continue reporting some, but managing at a station in San Luis Obispo, where my daughter works. Several people from WCCO also worked, and decided to try a new chapter. I never imagined anything like that, but I came out to work there, worked on missing person cases there as well. And then about 5 years ago, my husband and I relocated to the San Francisco Bay Area, where 3 of our children live, several grandchildren live, but continue to work on unsolved cases in a, I don't want to say retired, I call myself unassigned, but work on cases, particularly Jodi.
And you've also been involved, I know you did a lot of work with another case listeners will probably know, the Jacob Wetterling case, which you contributed a lot to. So in that case, in the work you did, I think you became close with his family. Is that fair to say?
I did.
Yeah,
I did. And Jodi and Jacob were in many ways my bookends, if you will. They were the 2 cases that stayed with me the longest, leaving Minnesota, moving away, feeling like I had a lot of unfinished business since I'd gotten so close to their families. And then actually when I was in California, there was a big break after 27 years in Jacob's case. And I flew back and spent several months working a special assignment with the NBC affiliate there, KARE 11, working on Jacob's case. And it was a day that I never imagined that Jacob would actually be found. It was a horrible day. I remember being awakened in the morning in San Francisco, hearing that there was a rumor he'd been found. I called his mother. Through a text, she confirmed the horrible news, hopped on a plane the next day, and it was awful. I was in court when the man who killed him described what he did. But as awful as it was, it gave me a renewed sense of hope that maybe finally finding answers in Jacob's case could help us find answers in Jodi's. Ironically, this is the 27th year since Jodi disappeared, and that's a big number on my mind right now. Jodi was 27 when she disappeared. She disappeared on June 27th. It'll be 27 years this June since she disappeared, and Jacob was found after 27 years. So I'm kind of clinging to that number right now.
Well, let's hope that this 27th year is the year. And just to sort of segue into this, how and when did you become involved in Jodi's case?
In Jodi's case, I didn't get directly involved until about 2 years after she was abducted. I was working on a case of a serial rapist in the Twin Cities, Tony DeJuan Jackson. He had been arrested and charged with 4 rapes in 2 weeks in the Twin Cities, which was a very high number for anybody for that kind of thing, mostly stranger cases. And when police were doing some background check, which is typical, they looked to other cities he might have lived in because you don't usually wake up one morning and become a serial rapist. And one of the cities they came across was Mason City. So authorities, Woodbury police sent a 3-ring binder background information on Jackson to the Mason City police. I didn't know anything about that until several months later. Another officer tipped me off that they had alerted Mason City and thought we might want to do some digging. We did some digging, and not only did we find through our WCCI team that Jackson was living in Mason City at the time, but he was living 2 blocks from Jodi Station. He'd broken up with his girlfriend the week before. A bunch of things that said, certainly didn't connect Jackson, but said, take a look. So that's how I first started covering that. And that was about 25 years ago. And continued to cover Jodi over the years for anniversaries. And even after I moved to California, that's when I joined the Find Jodi team. Josh Benson, the co-founder, invited me to join. So I continued in a volunteer role, if you will, not working for WCCO, but as a volunteer with the Find Jodi team.
So it's safe to say after all this time, you've gone all in on trying to help bring a resolution to Jodi's case.
Yes, and it's a very humbling experience because I don't know that they're any closer today than they were. I hope they were, but I don't know that we're any closer to having answers today than we were when I was first on this 25 years ago, when Jodi disappeared 27 years ago. We have renewed hope because of the advances in DNA. But the flip side, as you know, is there was very little evidence at the scene, very little to work with, but we still have hope.
Yeah, and definitely I'd like to ask you about some of the stuff and some of the things that have been reported. This is a case that I've personally been intrigued with since the very first time I saw Jodi's segment on Unsolved Mysteries, all that time ago. And I could chat with you for hours about this, and but out of respect for your time and the listeners' time, I'm going to try and do a condensed rundown with you on the case. What's this journey been like for you all this time since you first came into learning about the case versus all these years later now, with everything you've learned and looked at? Where were you when you first came in, and where are you now?
So where I was initially, it was an intriguing mystery. We had somebody, first of all, who does the same thing my colleagues and I do for a living. She was going to work that morning to work at a TV station. So there was that initial hook of feeling a connection. She was from Minnesota. This was not a national story to us. This was a local woman who grew up a couple hours from where I lived in the Twin Cities, who was working in a starter market 2 hours south of the Twin Cities. So it was an intriguing mystery involving a fellow journalist. As years went on, I would say, especially the last 10 years as I've been part of the Find Jodi team and I've gotten to know Jodi's family even better, it's very personal. I have a corner in my home office. It's my Jodi corner, if you will, where our podcast area is set up. All of our team members have podcast equipment in their homes cross country. And I look at Jodi's pictures. I have an album of her photos that I made last summer after meeting with her sister, Joanne. And it's humbling, it's frustrating. And I keep thinking, what am I missing? Is there something in all this stuff I've worked on over the years? So many people have worked on, so many people have been Jodi's journey. What are we missing? And what can we do to keep it fresh, to get that person? I'm not convinced that the person who took Jodi will come forward, but I know enough from my experience on the crime beat that relationships change, consciences come to prevail. And I'm hoping that somebody will come forward. And what do we need to do to give her family answers, give her friends answers, give the community answers? And frankly, those of us who worked on it need it. I feel this need for answers. Lately, I've been watching a lot of forensic files, and part of me is obviously a topic of interest, but I found that I needed to find something that gets solved. And having this unsolved cloud over me is there all the time. There's not a day when any of us on our team isn't thinking about it, isn't thinking, what can we do? It's there all the time. And I just hope that it's not too distant future that I can be part of changing our team from Find Jodi to Found Jodi. Family needs it. We need it.
Yeah, that's a good transition to have from Find Jodi to Found Jodi. Along the way, what were some of the red herrings or rabbit holes that may have sidetracked you over the years in trying to find answers?
I would say that there have been a lot of red herrings, but it's hard to know at the time what's a red herring, what's a possibility. I know at one point I was covering a killer in Minnesota who was looked at, Donald Blum, but they were able to, through an alibi, verify that I believe he was in a hospital at the time. So that didn't go anywhere. But given his history, it sure said, take a look. Tony Jackson, the police have ruled him out, but there are a lot of things that sure said there's something there. But as I said, police have ruled him out. In the past couple of years, we had a tip from somebody who was convinced that Dustin Honkin, a drug dealer, mass killer in Mason City, might be involved, in part because there's a photo that we had on our site of Jodi with some people having pizza. And the guy looked so much like Dustin Honkin. And we did some digging, and finally we realized, no, it was just a lookalike, somebody Jodi was in college with in England. But I thought, wow, if we could put Jodi in anything with him, that would be a connection. There's been a lot of speculation, and we've not ever been able to confirm that Dustin Honkin's partner in his murders, Angela Johnson, might have been working at the country club where Jodi was part of the Mason City golf tournament fundraiser the night before. We've never been able to confirm that she was there. We talked to a number of people who were at the tournament. I wrote to Angela in prison, and I wrote to her under the auspices basically that servers often remember things, and could she help me remember anything from that night? And she wrote back and said basically that no, she was no longer working there. She was working just at the waterfront in nearby Cedar Lake, and that she wasn't there. I mean, I have no proof one way or the other, but if we had connected somebody with Jodi just hours before she disappeared, who was part of murdering a bunch of people and burying them all those years. So that spent a lot of time. And there have been others over the years. Some are big, some are small. Most of what we work on, you'll never see on our site. We don't put things out there unless we can confirm it as much as possible. But as I said, even just that photo, I was like frozen for a day thinking, my gosh. And I ran it by some investigators in other departments, which we often do. We reach for outside help, and they said, God, it's got to be the guy. It wasn't.
It's got to be a letdown to get hot for someone that you think could be the guy, and then it's not.
The other thing we run into a lot is we're circling back to people at the key apartments and people interviewed years ago, and I cannot tell you how many times either people's memories have faded or they're deceased. The first thing I do is a Google search, and up pops an obituary. That happened a couple of days ago, and it's just so frustrating. And as I said, even if you do track people down, some people's memories are better than others. Some people have told police one thing back then, and things are different now. So the case doesn't get any better from that perspective.
Yeah, that's frustrating. Based on what you know and what you've learned about Jodi's case, do you think she was the victim of a random crime, or maybe being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or do you think there's evidence to support her being targeted as part of some kind of organized plan to abduct her as a plan?
I can really only partially answer that. What I can say is I don't believe, when you look at discuss the setup of where her car was, how close it was to the building, the opportunity window was so narrow that I don't believe it was somebody just driving down Kentucky Avenue where the key apartments where she lives are located. It wasn't. You would not have the time to be driving down or even just pulling into the lot and seeing Jodi. You had to be in place to grab her. So that leaves people who had to know her schedule. And one of the things we have found, unfortunately, is Jodi was extremely accessible. Her phone number, home address are listed right in the phone book. Her apartment building at the time was required to have your name on the mailbox. She was visible. I talked to other people in the complex who remembered seeing her get ready some morning. She was easy to watch. So if you were an obsessed fan or somebody interested in Jodi, she would be easy to figure out from her work schedule. She had the same schedule every day. Granted, that morning she was running late, but she had the same schedule. Or for somebody who knew her personally and had a relationship, they would know her schedule as well. So she was, unfortunately, very, very easy target, very vulnerable.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point because she was running late that day. And how late was she that day running?
Well, she was due at work at 3:30. When she hadn't gotten there about 4:10, Amy Coons, her assistant producer, called her. And she said she thought Jodi sounded like she'd overslept, that she'd be in 20 minutes. Yeah. So she was running late. And she said she'd been late before, not on a routine basis, but it was not the first time Jodi had been running late. Yeah, so that brutal shift is a brutal shift.
Oh, yeah. That schedule is tough. And it's interesting that if someone was targeting her and went there with a plan, they probably waited for an extra long amount of time since she was running so late.
Right. And if they waited, that potentially could work in the favor of investigators if they collected enough stuff from the scene, and we don't know what they have. But if somebody was, say, smoking a cigarette, Paul Holes mentioned this on a recent Murder Squad podcast, the person's waiting, and if she's not there, could they get more frustrated? Could they have left more themselves at the scene? Hopefully they collected things. We know there are a bunch of beer cans have been seen out on the curb in front of one of the apartment buildings in the same complex prior to Jodi's abduction. Did they collect those? We don't know, but potentially whoever was waiting would have been there a bit longer than usual. Because again, we don't believe somebody just burst in, even though it looks like a blitz attack when Jodi was actually grabbed and her things were scattered near her car. It doesn't seem like somebody just came running across the lot to get her.
Yeah, it seems like they were almost lying in wait for her.
Well, and I think it was 12 steps from her building,
Wow.
12 steps from her coming down. She came down the steps from her second floor apartment, which would have been easy to watch her, see her lights go out in the apartment, come down the steps, go to her car, trying to put her key in the car. And we believe she was ambushed from behind at that point.
Yeah. And you bring up a good point because, being in the public eye and a young, single, attractive woman, it seems like there's endless scenarios. Is it a dangerous stalker or fan, or is it someone in Jodi's personal life that had a real connection with her of some sort? And I think
it go either way. And we also know that before Jodi, about 8 months before Jodi's abducted, there was an incident that prompted her to report a white truck that had been following her when she was out jogging. And being in the business, I know from my own perspective, you aren't going to call the police just because somebody's staring at you. It was enough that Jodi was uncomfortable to make a report. That was 8 months earlier. And then in March, just a couple of months before she was abducted, she took a safety class and told the local self-defense people that she felt she'd been followed. Nothing specific, but it's kind of that. There's a book called The Gift of Fear, that sense you might have that somebody's following you.
Mm-hmm.
I have to wonder if Jodi had some sense of that.
Yeah, a little bit of a pattern maybe that made her uneasy.
Exactly. And it said she was so easy. She would talk on her show. The nature of being the morning and noon anchor is to say, I'm going to the tournament today, or I'm going to be doing this. This is what I did last night. I was shopping at Hy-Vee's. Those are things that anchors particularly are encouraged to connect with their audience, but those same things that build a base and connection with the audience are things that could make you very vulnerable for somebody like a sexual stalker.
Yeah, and plus her being friendly, outgoing, and accessible, I think maybe made her even more prone to that.
And somebody could misread her friendliness because, again, it's part of your persona when you're on TV to be that way.
Sure.
And she was that way. Jodi's persona actually very much fit the Jodi that I've come to know. I've never met her. She was very outgoing. She connected with people. She took the time. She could barely get through the grocery store because everybody would want to talk to her. In the parking lot, other residents mentioned she would stop and talk with one woman with wanting to hold her baby and people admiring her new car. She was very accessible to just about everybody.
Sure. And Jodi seemed to detail, as it's been reported, a lot of her life in a diary. Do you know if there was anything of interest found in that diary that maybe police seemed keen on, or maybe indicated, a little bit more detail about some of the suspicions Jodi had about being followed or anything?
Right. Well, the police have never shared any of that publicly with us. And the only reason we know that the diary exists is because of, the former police chief, Dave Ellingson's wife, Cheryl, mailed it anonymously at the time to a reporter at the Globe Gazette. It's 84 pages. There are several pages excerpts that they put in there. And the excerpts, presumably they would have put the most interesting things. It's possible they held something back. But the kind of things that struck me is that I didn't see fear being written about. Maybe she's putting her best face forward. You could feel that she was frustrated, though, and wanted to move on to another market. But she talked glowingly about her. Just 2 days earlier, she'd come back from a water skiing trip with her older friend John Van Sice, her friend Ani Cruz. She was with Tammy Baker. They were in Iowa City. Just seemed like she was loving that part of life. And, there's a lot of mention of, John Van Sice, whose name has popped up a lot as someone who's had a lot of interest in her, but nothing negative, nothing to them that was published anyway. And presumably they would have put the highlights. And as a journalist, you would put the most interesting parts. And
sure,
but nothing that jumps out from my perspective.
Yeah, and I think we know in most crimes that police start looking at people that are closest to the victim, and most of the time the perpetrator in this kind of crime is someone that is close to them or known to them. Yet, here we have possibility of it could be anyone, stranger or someone close to, and hopefully there'd be something in the diary that would maybe shed some light, but. Maybe that's one thing that down the road they'll share if there's anything in there.
But Jodi's life, again, her career makes it different from just anybody going to work in the morning.
Sure.
Anybody. And I think you basically have to investigate on parallel tracks, the track of all the people she knew, all the people that they can find that she interacted with. And that's why they went over her last 48 hours, 72 hours. She was with a lot of people the day before. At the Mason City Country Club, at the golf tournament dinner. Earlier in the day, she was at the Highland Park golf course where much of the golfing was rained out. But she was with a lot of people. And I've interviewed many people at the event, and there's no indication of anybody who seemed to be focused on her. The only discomfort about anything that came up was I've interviewed two of her golf teammates, who said, she did mention was going to change her phone number the next day. She told them that she had been getting kind of nasty, annoying phone calls. Didn't seem overly concerned, but again, was she trying not to seem too afraid? But that was the only additional clue on top of what we heard from the self-defense instructors, and as well as the actual police report she had made on the white truck. So those were some things. The flip side is the police have said over the years they don't believe that she was a target of a stalker. So we just don't know.
Yeah, and it's very frustrating with the little tidbits looking back after she goes missing, of getting calls, having weird vehicles, wanting to take a defense course. Maybe 9 times out of 10, she never would have been attacked. That never would have happened, and those little things wouldn't matter. But looking back, when you're sort of turning over all the stones and you find these little nuggets along the way, it's got to be frustrating to not have any more information about some of these instances.
Well, and they could be unrelated to, say, another stalker. I've covered enough stranger rapists where the victims didn't know they were being stalked. So there could be something, these weird things were going on. They certainly, are red flags. And you would hope that every angle of it was checked out as much as it could be.
Sure. And there's been so many news stories, podcasts, TV shows, the like, about Jodi's case. And with all of that coverage, there's bound to be, details or mistakes that aren't true or inaccurate. I think for listeners out there, are there any glaring things that are widely reported or people widely think that are simply not true or inaccurate that maybe you'd like to help clear up right now?
Sure, I appreciate that. And we really tried in the past year and a half with our podcast to try to be sort of the podcast of record. We've corrected things we've had over the year based on information that years ago we thought was true. One of the most widely incorrect piece of information reported out there is that there was blood on the car. And Frank Stearns, the investigator, said, and others have said there was no blood on the scene, but for some reason that has been reported over and over. The initial reports over the years, and even just a few years ago, and even sometimes with police officers being quoted, said that the truck that was following her was a dark truck, a black truck. In fact, it was a white pickup truck. So those are some of the kind of things that we don't know if it's relevant. Was that truck relevant? But certainly having it out for years that it was a black truck versus a white truck didn't help get answers.
Yeah, something like that little detail can be a big difference, because someone out there that kept hearing black truck, they may have had someone in mind to report, but it can't be him because this is a black truck they're looking for, and this person drives a white truck. So little details like that can be very important. So the 27th anniversary of Jodi's case is approaching, which is why we're covering her case now to help keep spreading the word about it, and a renewed effort to keep it in the headlines. Do you have anything planned to sort of mark the anniversary, any events or new details that might be being shared about her case, anything like that?
At this point, we don't have more details to share. You never know. There's another big series that I can't go into at this point, but there is some more national media planned in the next couple of months. So there'll be some more visibility. There's been a visibility a few months ago. 2020 did something. So there's been a lot of attention. What we're going to focus on, we will have a small event in Mason City and really hitting on, as I mentioned earlier, the 27th. I'm putting together the number 27, putting together 27 photos to represent all the years of Jodi's life. She will have been gone as long as she was alive, 27 years. And think of all the things she has missed, her family has missed, the chance to get married, have children, go to her aunt's wedding, go to her family events. Her mother never got to say goodbye to her. There's so many things that have happened. So we want to bring home the loss, and we want to also keep up the message as we did in our billboard last year. Don't sit in silence. The time to talk is now. Kind of representing the urgency, as I said earlier. Memories get worse, witnesses die, or potential information dies, but we're going to hit home on that pretty heavily. A more personal message and urgency as well.
And I think you brought up a good point earlier that, allegiances change, relationships change, people, die, that, maybe someone knew something about someone, but they were afraid to come forward because they were in a relationship or they were afraid of this person. Now they're deceased or something like that. And, over time, maybe the passage of that time allows for people to free up from these things that prevented them from coming forward sooner. And it's not too late to come forward now with information if they have it.
And I think there's a good chance that the answer still could be in northern Iowa, southern Minnesota. I mean, it's great to have all this attention, national attention, and it gets a lot of people talking, and it keeps Jodi's case visible. But I still think there could be somebody there who knows somebody whose behavior changed or knows something that isn't quite sure. But if that person is there, I'm hoping they will reach out to law enforcement, reach out to Mason City Police or the Iowa DCI, FBI. And if they won't go to law enforcement, they can reach out to us at Find Jodi as well. But just don't sit on that information. You never know where one piece might fit in a larger puzzle of things that investigators have. Maybe it's something we have, but just don't make her family wait another year. And as Patty Wetterling, Jacob's mother, said in an interview I did with her a few months ago, if nothing else, unburden yourself. Maybe it has nothing to do with anything, but if you've been carrying it around, share it. Don't hoard it. Don't keep it to yourself. Share it with somebody, law enforcement being hopefully your first choice.
Yeah. And along those lines, moving into sort of what Jodi's family has gone through. I know you've gotten close with them, but I imagine it's been hard on them. One reason because of obviously what happened to Jodi, but also because they have to get her story out there. They have to keep reliving and rehashing all of this.
They live with that, and on top of it, they live every time there's a development. Last year, some remains were found in the river in Winnebago. Could it be Jodi? You go through all this range of emotions. It's horrible. And could it be this scenario, or there's a serial killer in the news? To think, could that be the serial killer who maybe also grabbed Jodi? I think the phrase is called ambiguous loss. You're living with this undefined loss. And I remember Patty Wetterling, Jacob's mother, saying that as horrific as it was to she always hoped that Jacob would come walking through the door. Never moved, didn't change her number, but it was worse not knowing. And at least they finally got his little hockey jacket back. They got to say goodbye. And I think that's what Jodi's family, they don't expect her to be found alive. And she was declared legally dead after several years, but they want to have a service. They want to honor her. They want to bring her home to Long Prairie, Minnesota.
Yeah. And I've talked to a lot of people of, family of missing and murdered people, and the people that have murder victims in their family, that's bad enough, but they have some kind of peace in knowing they could say goodbye, having some kind of outcome. Where I've talked to the people that have a missing loved one, they just don't have anything. They have no answers, and there's just this void that stays there because they never find out where their loved one is. So I imagine it's got to be really, really hard on Jodi's family.
It's horrific. Every time I call Jodi's sister, I try to think of something positive, whether there's another show that's interested or something, but just knowing that, one of these days it's going to be that awful call, like when I reached out to Patty Wetterling. But at least it'll be closer to the end of their journey. And I don't think anyone likes the word closure, but there's resolution, and they don't have resolution, and they don't have Jodi, and they want her home.
Yeah, that's something important to point out, that there's not really closure, but more, some kind of finality, some kind of answers.
And hopefully justice. I mean, they want Jodi, but they also want justice for whoever. They want accountability. They want answers and accountability to who took Jodi, where is Jodi, and have somebody face the consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's not too much to ask and to want at this point, for, just having a name, even if the person's deceased, that did this. If they can at least find out who it was, maybe they can fill in the blanks on some other things and have some kind of answers.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I did want to ask you a couple specific questions before we wrap up, and to see what your take is on these. One of them was about the white van that seemed to be connected to Jodi's case. Is there anything to support it definitely being part of the mystery? And have any suspects that have been looked at been tied to a van like the one that was seen?
There have been some people who've had vans. I mean, probably any number of people you look at have a connection to a van. But to this day, the van that police had described to them by a witness driving by has never been located. So it's hard to know if that van was just incidental or what it means. But that has not been part of the resolved answer. Because again, we don't know until we know what happened to Jodi. It's unlikely we'll know the significance if the van was there.
Yeah, and the white van to me is reminiscent of like the DC sniper case when they said there's a white van. There's a white van everywhere you look. So.
Right, and what was it? A Toyota? I forget what they had. A small sedan. It wasn't a van.
Yeah,
in that case.
Yeah, and it's not something as a red Corvette or something like that would be a lot more easy to separate. But this is something that could be anywhere and have any reason for being there, not necessarily connected.
And regarding the van, there's sometimes been confusion when people hear about the white truck. That white truck involved in the October 1994 stalking incident was a small, white, newer pickup truck. So these are different things, and that's something that people sometimes get confused with a white van following her. No, it was not a white van. It was a white pickup truck.
Yeah, and that's important to clear up. And then another thing I wanted to ask you specifically about was Jodi's friend, John Van Cise. I know you mentioned him earlier. A lot of people have been suspicious of him over the years, and it seemed as if there were some ebbs and flows in that interest. But correct me if I'm wrong, police recently got a warrant for GPS vehicles that he didn't own. Am I correct on that?
Right. Actually was 2017. March 2017 was the last really kind of visible chapter, if you will, in terms of the investigation. That month, and we did not know about it for another year after it happened, that month, the Mason City police were able to obtain search warrants to get GPS data off 2 cars that were manufactured after Jodi disappeared, vehicles supposedly connected in some way to John Van Cise. Later, when Police Chief Jeff Brinkley, Mason City Chief, was interviewed by 48 Hours, they said they did not produce anything. The other thing that happened that month is, for the second time, a federal grand jury was convened to look into the case, and John Van Cise was subpoenaed to come up to Iowa from Arizona, where he lives now, to provide palm prints, fingerprints, and a DNA swab. And both of those things happened in March. Nothing came of the grand jury, the second grand jury to meet. Grand jury proceedings are secret, so the only way you can know anything is if somebody testified before that and they choose to share it with you, unless something comes of it. So that was an active month. The search warrant on the GPS data was sealed for a year. A judge in Cerro Gordo County sealed it, and it will probably continue to be sealed each year when the prosecutor goes and requests that it be kept secret, because it's going to have key facts of the case are likely to be in there. What was the probable cause that the police had to convince a judge to let them get a search warrant? So we will be, until somebody is arrested, charged, convicted in Jodi's case, that happens, it'll be the soonest we're likely to see the contents of that. We saw that with Jacob Wetterling's case. We didn't see anything till, maybe a year after conviction in that case.
Yeah. And it's safe to say that if they're looking at vehicles he was connected to, they still considered him a person of interest at that time? Would that be a fair statement?
Yes, you would have to convince a judge to approve a search warrant. You would have to explain why somebody was being looked at. To get to subpoena someone's DNA, prints, etc., you'd have to be looked at. And again, that was about 5 years ago. It was 5 years ago in March that happened.
And I'm interested. Obviously didn't do any research about navigation systems and GPS in vehicles from back 27 years ago. I don't know how much of that was available in vehicles, but I'm thinking, and again, this is just me throwing a theory out there, that perhaps these are newer vehicles that weren't even available at the time. And they thought maybe he would go to specific locations. That might have been what they were looking at, possibly.
I think given the fact that he was ordered to come back to Iowa at that time, they're thinking that they were probably trying to track where he was. Again, we're left to speculate because we don't have access to the details, but that's what we believe. And they could have gotten the things that they were getting from him, the DNA, the palm print, the fingerprint, there's stuff that the FBI certainly could have obtained in their Phoenix office. They didn't have to have him come to Iowa. So there was clearly a reason they wanted him to come to Iowa.
Okay. And to your point, too, was he cooperative? Did he provide everything they asked for? Do you know?
Yeah. From everything we've always heard, he's been totally cooperative. But again, the chief, who won't discuss the details of it, did tell 48 Hours Jim Axelrod in 2018 that nothing came out of those searches. He did not discuss the prints and the federal grand jury stuff because, again, those proceedings are secret unless somebody testifies, chooses to speak.
Sure. And as we wrap up, I'm going to put you on the spot. I'm just going to ask you what your personal theory is based on everything you know and you've learned, and maybe without mentioning a name, if you don't want to, who you think might be responsible.
I would say, having covered this case now for 25 years and my experience covering many others, including, I often mention Jacob Wetterling's, where the focus is often on somebody else who sometimes turns out not to be the person. For example, in Wetterling's case, it was a neighbor, and I was there when police tore up his property. They did it several times, and he had absolutely nothing to do with the case. So I think I go back to my answer a few years ago, none of the above. People like Tony Jackson absolutely felt when you have a very brutal serial rapist living near Jodi, maybe it was just a coincidence, but I feel he needed to be looked at. A number of other names have come up over the years, but until I see what police have on anybody, I'm saying none of the above, and keep on digging and keep asking questions.
Yeah, that's probably what it's going to take to get answers here, is the continual search, and maybe you uncover something that somehow has gone uncovered all this time, and it might be the thing that makes the difference in solving the case.
Exactly.
Well, Caroline, I can't thank you enough for coming on to discuss Jodi's case. You've been a wealth of information, and I think it's through the efforts of people like yourself and Scott Fuller, who's a good podcast friend of mine, who's helped get the word out. People like you all doing the work to get the case out there makes a big difference, keeps it in the public eye. So thanks for your efforts.
Well, thank you. And what you're doing here is part of that as well. You never know if somebody listening to this show has a connection with Mason City or has somebody that's out there. And I'm just hoping that that person doesn't just share it with a relative. If they have something, reach out to police, reach out to find Jodi, but just don't make her family wait another year without answers.
Definitely. And if people want to, if they have information, they want to share it with you, or they want to see what you're reporting on, where can they find all of your work at?
A couple places. If they want to follow us on Facebook, go to findjodi.com Facebook page. And if you want to reach out to us anonymously, Find Jodi has a telephone number, 970-458-JODI. Again, 970-458-JODI or 5634. Our email is team@findjodi.com. Again, team@findjodi.com. And if you go to our website, we have contacts for the police, those agencies as well. But we'd love to have people join in our journey. We have flyers we put out. You could put up a flyer on your Twitter account, put it in your social media, #FindJodi and Jodi Huisentruit. Do everything you can just to, wherever you are, to keep her visible.
Yeah, keep the word out there, and you never know, especially sharing it in maybe in those areas too that where the truth may lie. Especially, you might get someone who said, "Oh, I thought that case was solved," and maybe they heard something and just assumed that the case was solved, and you never know. Maybe they have a tip or some information. So it's important.
We had that a couple of years ago where someone came forward and they thought somebody had been charged, and then they heard something else about someone else whose name came up, which didn't jive with their information, and they reached out to us. So we believe that and I've done this enough years to believe there are people like that out there who could have a clue and need to come forward.
Absolutely. Well, again, Caroline, thank you so much for your insights to the case.
Sure. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Missing Persons. If you can provide any information to help solve the case we discussed in this episode, please contact the appropriate authorities.
If you enjoy this podcast, please take a moment to tell your friends about missing persons and invite them to listen to the show. Word of mouth will help us grow and bring these cases to a larger audience. You can also help us by taking a moment to rate and review Missing Persons on the platform you're listening to us now on.
We'd like to tell you a little bit about our Patreon program. If you visit patreon.com/missingpodcast, you can sign up to help this podcast through ongoing monthly support. As a thank you, we'll give you an on-air shout-out, a thank you card and sticker, plus you'll get early access to ad-free episodes of the show and any bonus content.
Your Patreon support also goes towards helping the missing, because every dollar that we earn through Patreon will be split with charlieproject.org, the wonderful website that's been sharing information about so many missing persons cases for years. We hope you'll consider supporting the show. Just a reminder that new episodes of Missing Persons air every other Saturday. If you want to find us on social media, you can search Facebook for Missing Persons Podcast. And we're also on Twitter with the handle @missing_pod. And of course, you can find us on our website, missingpersonspodcast.net. As we wrap up this episode, we'd like to play a preview of a true crime podcast we think you'll like. It's called Cause of Death. Be sure to give it a listen. On behalf of Jess Betancourt, this is Mike Morford saying thanks, and we'll see you next time on Missing Persons.
Hello, and welcome to Cause of Death. My name is Jackie Moranti. I've been studying infectious disease for 14 years in various research settings. I have a Bachelor's of Science from Colorado State University in microbiology, immunology, and virology. I've worked with diseases like tuberculosis, SARS-1, and SARS-CoV-2, better known as COVID-19, and I've worked with EHV1. It's my feeling that if we look back at the pandemics of the past, we may be able to better handle the pandemics of the future. The problem is, we have to learn our lessons first. Come along with me while I tell you about the pandemics, the epidemics, and the outbreaks, and how we never seem to learn our lesson.
Missing Persons is produced under the name AbJack Entertainment by Mike Morford and Jessica Betancourt. It's hosted by Mike Morford and Jessica Betancourt, with writing and research by Jessica Betancourt and editing by Mike Morford. Be sure to listen every other Saturday for an all-new episode of Missing Persons.